Thank you very much. Thank you. Vice Chancellor, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen. 60 years ago, I stepped out of an old Dakota aircraft on the coast of West Africa onto a grass airstrip and saw for the first time the astonishing beauty and wonder and complexity of the natural world as exemplified by the tropical rainforest. There was a hedge of hibiscus, wonderful scarlet plumes, and settling on those amazing butterflies, papilios. I looked closer and put my foot down, and I saw a plant suddenly move its leaflets and disappear. Sensitive mimosa. I never knew a plant could move like that. And then I saw a chameleon. All this within a tiny area just off an airstrip. I was astonished, but it was a revelation of how miraculous the natural world can be that has never ceased to affect me. I was there to film a collecting expedition that had been sent out by the London Zoo, the Zoological Society of London, to collect more animals to put into its cages. Zoos don't do that anymore. We know that the world, the natural world, cannot take that sort of depredation. Zoos now breed the animals that they exhibit. But that was then. And then was the tail end of a tradition that started when the zoo was founded back in 1826, when zoological science was concerned with compiling a catalogue of the natural world, when the objective of the society, which was actually defined as for the advancement of zoology and the introduction of new and curious subjects of the animal kingdom to this country. It exhibited these animals, it measured its success by the number of new species which it was able to show and how many species they had. That was zoology at that time, and it was an essential stage in the development of our science. But at the same time that it was founded in 1826, a Yorkshire squire was building what amounts to the first bird sanctuary in Europe, or anywhere as far as I can discover. We know him now, if we know him at all, as an eccentric. And an eccentric he certainly was. Though he was a wealthy landowner, he dressed always like a farm labourer. He went barefoot, winter and summer. He was double-jointed. It's well known that in a conversation, he was likely to lift up his leg and scratch his head with his big toe. He could pick up nuts with his toes. He had spent over 12 years as a young man looking after sugar estates in what was then British Guiana in South America, now Guyana. And he came back with a passion for the wonders and the tropics, for natural history that I've described. And he was appalled by what he found in his Yorkshire home. The Industrial Revolution had just started. Coal mines were ripping up the countryside and pouring out their waste on tips. Iron smelters were roaring away, Factories were belching out fumes, factories that made sulfuric acid. Other factories, and one that he worried him desperately, was boiling animal fats to make soap. The countryside was ravaged. And in response to that, he started to build a wall around his estates. A wall that in places measured 18 feet high. It was 8 miles around. It cost him the equivalent of £650,000 in today's currencies. But inside, and mark this, inside in 1826, he built an artificial sandbank for sand martins with sites for 51 nests. Everybody was welcome from the local countryside to come in and see the natural world as he saw it. He had a lake with a heronry and lots of ducks on it. They were welcome to come in, provided they didn't bring a gun and provided they didn't have a dog. He would give local children sixpence if they brought in a hedgehog. This was a visionary man, to the extent that he particularly welcomed people who were mentally disturbed, who were kept in what was called then a lunatic asylum nearby. And he welcomed them into his front room, where they could sit, provided with a telescope, in order to look at the wild fowl that was on the lake in front of his house. He believed it pacified them. He believed it brought them solace. And he was right. He was a great pioneer, one whose name, Charles Waterton, has seldom spoken these days. But he set a pattern for this country and indeed the world. A pattern that was only slowly taken up. It wasn't until 1889 that the Royal Society for Protection of Birds was founded. That was founded because during the 19th century, it was the fashion for women to wear bird plumes, egrets, birds of paradise, and also our own domestic birds. The fashion nearly exterminated the great crested grebe, a bird that, thank goodness, is now commonly seen. But then, because of its tippets, was slaughtered without mercy. That was the first animal protection charity. And it very soon developed its concerns beyond the question of plumes and onto the survival and protection of birds in general. Soon after that, in 1903, the first international conservation body was founded in this country. Fauna and Flora International, we call it today, but then it was called and founded as the Society for Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the British Empire. And in case you think that's limiting, let me remind you that in 1903, the British Empire covered something like a third of the terrestrial surface of this planet. It was a society for all kinds of people, for explorers. Sir Harry Johnston, who discovered the okapi in the Congo, he was a member. Great naturalists, the Duke of Bedford, for example, who kept Père David's deer, the rare Chinese deer that was almost extinct in the wild, in his estates in Bedfordshire. And there were straightforward big game hunters. Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, he was a member. But those people who were big game hunters, of course, had a very keen eye, an assessment of what was happening to the natural world. And they knew that the animals that they were so dedicated in their pursuit of were disappearing. And they set up the first big game parks of preservation. The Kruger Park in Africa, the Corbett Park in India. And soon they changed their name from the Society for Preservation of Wild Fauna and became the Fauna Preservation Society, now FFI. And they, FFI, took things further. They recognized that animals needed protection, not just by putting walls around areas, but active protection. And that there were some cases that were so urgent that they would have to be protected by taking the surviving animals into captivity and breeding it there. And with the help of the Zoological Society of London, and indeed Phoenix Zoo in the United States, they took the first great success of this kind, the Arabian oryx, which they bred in captivity and eventually returned to the wild, to Arabia, where today they now flourish. And so the movement grew. There were a lot of people in this country particularly, which has a strong tradition of the local naturalist, the local specialist, the man who knows more about beetles in one particular area than any other. And it was those people with those specialist interests who made the next step, who founded what we now know as the naturalist trusts in this country. The first one was in Norfolk in 1926. And actually it was quite a long time before other counties followed. But Yorkshire did in 1946. Lincolnshire did in 1948. But the concern for birds, which the RSPB had first brought into focus, became one of these main themes for conservationists. In 1922, the International Committee for Bird Preservation was formed, now called BirdLife International. And in 1933, Max Nicholson, a great British conservationist, who was not only an expert ornithologist, but also a great administrator who knew his ways around bureaucracy, who knew his ways around Whitehall. Max founded the British Trust for Ornithology, with not just sitting watching birds, but would be proactive. They would start serious programs of ringing that would accumulate big banks of data that would be useful for the ornithologist. But still, even though these organizations I mentioned, even though they were very active before the last war, there was still the notion, generally among the public, that this world of ours was so huge that mankind, puny mankind, couldn't actually seriously damage it. This was a time, let me remind you, when cities, towns on the coast of this country thought it was perfectly acceptable to pour untreated sewage into the sea, because the sea was so huge. How could it possibly be soiled by output from a town? We know better than that. The rainforest, that was so immense. How could man destroy or damage that? How wrong people were. That was before the last war. But the last war marks a huge change. The last war ended with the appalling loss of human life that was involved when the atomic bombs were dropped. Whatever the rights and wrongs of dropping those bombs, the fact was that people came back from the war sickened by slaughter. One of those who fought in that war was a young man, a young wildfowler called Peter Scott, who had a very distinguished, brave career in the Royal Navy. When he came back, he started to resume what had been the passion of his young life, which was wildfowling. But very quickly, he felt sickened by slaughter and decided instead to keep the live birds. And he assembled a collection in which he hoped to accumulate examples of all the species of wildfowl that existed on Earth, and if possible to breed those, as many as he could. And it was in the course of doing that he built on the tradition that had been started by Fauna and Fauna International. He discovered that the Hawaiian goose that lived on the lava fields of Hawaii had been reduced to about 40 specimens. Most of it were in captivity. And he and one or two other people then started to try and breed nenes, as they are called, in captivity. And of course, he had huge success. And the Wildfowl Trust began to expand. At the same time, the Wildfowl Trust was founded in 1946, just after the war. And just after that, in 1948, the nations of this world, sickened by war, started to form the United Nations, one branch of which was the United Nations Educational and Scientific and Cultural Organization, which was headed by a British scientist, by a biologist, Sir Julian Huxley. And Julian Huxley decided that in the UNESCO, there ought to be a specific branch which looked after the natural world. The International Union of Conservation for Nature was founded. The problem it had was that it could see what was needed to be done, but it didn't have enough funds to do anything about it. And again, under Julian Huxley's leadership, he infected other people, including Sir Peter Scott, including the very distinguished ornithologist, Swiss ornithologist, Luc Hofmann, another very powerful businessman from South Africa, Anton Rupert. And those people, together with a group of others, founded the Worldwide Nature Fund, the Fund for Nature, as it's now called, WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. So they started by focusing their attention on species that were particularly endangered. Sir Peter himself designed the logo, the badge for the fund, which of course is the giant panda. A giant panda that was in danger then of serious danger of extinction. And initially, the focus of the fund was indeed on identifying animals that were in danger of extinction and developing programs in order to prevent that happening. But the scientists involved in the fund knew very well that those animals, those charismatic animals, are very important, but primarily as badges. If you want to save a giant panda, you have to save the bamboo forest in which it lives. Is a Javan rhinoceros on the verge of extinction in a concrete pit in a zoo? Is that truly a Javan rhinoceros? If that is all its future is, not so. You have to protect the Javan rainforest where the Javan rhinoceros lives. So, over the years, not only the scientists, but the public began to realize that conservation is not just about individual species. Conservation is about ecosystems, in which human beings, let us make it clear, also play a very important part. And now we begin to see that ecosystems are everywhere extensive. The ocean is an ecosystem. 2/3 of this planet are covered by sea, and we're treating the ocean appallingly. The ocean is in danger at the moment of acidification. There are some who think that it's almost gone too far. There are some who think that the coral reefs are doomed. Wherever we look, though, not only just oceans, rainforests, everybody knows what's happening to rainforests and how they also know what key factors they are in the health of the whole planet. The whole world, in fact, is in peril now. And why? There are lots of individual reasons for individual cases, but fundamentally, the reason is that there are so many human beings on this planet. In Charles Waterton's time, that Yorkshire squire building his first bird sanctuary in the world, the population of the world was 1.3 billion. Just before the First World War, that figure had grown to 1.7 billion. Now, 2010, another century on, we are approaching 7 billion people on this planet. What is to be done? What is to be done about this most personal and important privilege that each one of us have to reproduce ourselves? The one shred of hope that I can see is that wherever women are empowered and have the right to talk, to decide what to do with their own bodies, where they have education, where there is literacy, where there is medical facilities, the birth rate drops. And perhaps that's a moral that those countries where those facilities are common should think about giving help to those countries where it is not. We are now talking about a global situation. And in global situations, what first steps have to be taken by governments? People, you and I, feel powerless so often. You have to speak with the voice of a nation. And nations are doing so, individual nations are. There is cause for hope. In the island of Borneo is divided between 3 nations: Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. And the rainforests of Borneo, as I know to my personal evidence, have been devastated by people who wish to grow their own food, people who wish to grow food for others, like oil palms, by people who want to take timber. But that great damage which has been done is primarily around the coast, not unexpectedly. The center of Borneo, the heart of Borneo, which is largely mountainous, that still is largely inviolate. And those 3 governments, to their great credit, have now accepted a plan called the Heart of Borneo, in which national frontiers will dissolve and the rainforest will be seen as one essential unit. There are other examples. The peace parks in Africa are seeing that national frontiers, an inheritance largely from imperial times, national frontiers that interfere with the traditional migration routes of many animals should be broken down. And that is happening. The nations also got together to protect whales, a proposition which was particularly close to Peter Scott's heart. That is a great success. But in the end, it's us, people, who have to act. And that's why this Cambridge Conservation Initiative is so crucially important. It's based, after all, in the heart of this very great university, Charles Darwin's university. And around it, as you've heard, there are now clusters of conservation organizations. The Fauna and Fauna were called at one stage the penitent butchers. They're no longer penitent butchers, or at least they're penitent, but they're no longer butchers. And FFI has long been established outside Cambridge, or inside Cambridge, in fact. So there is one organization already here, the first international conservation organization, the RSPB, as I mentioned. Now a huge organization with an enormous income, great power, and something like 1 million members, 1 million members. The British Trust for Ornithology, BirdLife International, Traffic, which was established in 1976 to monitor the movement of wildlife around the world for commercial reasons and others. That's here. The Wildlife Trust, the Cambridge Trust, is here. IUCN, UNEP, Biodiversity Monitoring, that's here. Tropical Biological Association, that's here. And there are 6 university departments, as you've heard. Zoology, plant sciences, geography, land economy, the Judge Business School, as well as members of this university who aren't formally connected, but are nonetheless around the corner, nonetheless at the adjoining table in the coffee party. People, young people, lawyers, economists, political scientists, people, philosophers, all have contributions to make. I don't have to talk to this audience about the urgency of the crisis that we face, or its dimension. We are facing a real crisis. We all know that humanity, ourselves, depend upon the natural world for the food we eat, for the air we breathe, and as Charles Waterton recognized, sometimes for our very sanity. The world is there, it's in great peril, something has to be done. It seems to me that this country, which has a proud record of innovation in this particular field, is making one further international step, and one that is historic in this Cambridge initiative. I congratulate you all who have been responsible for doing this, and I wish the initiative the greatest of success. Thank you very much.